Hi, welcome in. This is an original story from Hidden Revenge family, and it took a turn you truly didn't see coming. Let's get into it.
The ballroom at the officers' club smelled like expensive cologne and overcooked steak. My father liked it that way. It felt official to him. I sat at a small round table near the back wall, nursing a glass of iced water and watching the room fill with decorated uniforms. Colonels, brigadiers, a few generals. Every chest covered in medals that caught the chandelier light like tiny mirrors. Tonight was my father's retirement party. Colonel Arthur Caldwell, 40 years in the Army. The man loved three things: discipline, reputation, and reminding everyone he had both. I didn't match the room. That was obvious. Most of the guests wore dress uniforms or expensive evening suits. I wore a simple black blouse and gray slacks I bought 2 years ago in Alexandria. No jewelry, no makeup except mascara. If you looked quickly, I probably looked like the catering manager. That was fine with me. The real center of the room stood about 20 feet away, my sister Kelsey, and her husband Vance. Kelsey had mastered the art of being noticed. She wore a bright red dress that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover instead of a military retirement party. Every time she laughed, half the room turned. Vance stood beside her like a billboard for success. Expensive suit, perfect haircut. The kind of confident smile that only shows up when someone thinks the world belongs to them. A small circle of officers and their wives had gathered around him. He was mid-story. $12 million, Vance said, lifting a glass of bourbon as if he were making a toast. That's the value of the contract. Military medical equipment. Our logistics company moves it overseas. Several heads nodded with polite admiration. 12 million always gets attention. One of the officers leaned in. That's serious business, Vance grinned. Somebody has to keep the supply chain moving. I watched him from my corner seat, not his face, his hands. His left wrist carried a watch that looked heavy enough to anchor a boat. Gold band, blue dial, a Rolex, or maybe a Patek Philippe. Either way, it cost more than my car. The watch wasn't what caught my attention, though. It was the phone. He held it low near his waist, tapping a quick message between sentences. The device had a small external screen and a hinge down the middle. A flip satellite phone, not the kind normal business people use. The kind people use when they don't want their calls appearing on normal networks. He snapped it shut and slid it into his jacket pocket like nothing had happened. Across the room, my father noticed where my eyes were pointing. His expression tightened. Arthur Caldwell had a very specific look he used when he thought someone might embarrass him. He gave me that look. The message was clear. Stay quiet. Don't cause a scene. Don't remind anyone you exist. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip of water. No problem. Across the room, Kelsey noticed the small group around her husband had grown larger. That was her favorite moment. The moment attention peaked. She adjusted a strand of blonde hair behind her ear and raised her voice just enough for nearby tables to hear. Speaking of the military, she said with a bright smile, "Did everyone meet my little sister yet?" Several people turned their heads. A few eyes landed on me. I kept sitting. Kelsey pointed across the room. "That's Sloan over there." One of the officers' wives leaned slightly forward. "Oh, I didn't know Colonel Caldwell had another daughter." Kelsey laughed softly. "Oh, she used to be in the Army too." "Used to?" The word floated through the room like perfume. Someone asked, "Really, what happened?" Kelsey tilted her head with the expression of someone delivering unfortunate news. "Well, Sloan had some mental health issues while she was serving." The table got quieter. She lowered her voice just enough to sound sympathetic, while still making sure everyone could hear. It was sad, honestly. The stress got to her. The Army had to discharge her early. A few people murmured politely. One of the women frowned. "Is she okay now?" Kelsey gave a small shrug. "She manages. She mostly does little odd jobs these days." The circle nodded in that slow, careful way people do when they're processing a tragedy that doesn't belong to them. I felt several sets of eyes drifting toward my corner again. My father stepped closer to Kelsey and gave a quiet, approving nod. Then he glanced at me, that same warning look. "Don't contradict her. Don't ruin tonight." I set my glass on the table. Across the room, Vance laughed at something one of the officers said and lifted his wrist to check the time. The watch face turned directly toward me. Under the chandelier light, I could see tiny engraved numbers along the back edge. Serial numbers. Interesting. A second later, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out again. Flip satellite phone, dark gray casing, small antenna ridge near the hinge. He opened it halfway and typed a quick message. From my angle, the screen tilted just enough. Numbers flashed briefly at the top. Device ID, 7 digits. He closed the phone again and slipped it back into his jacket. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands on the table. Across the room, Kelsey continued performing her version of my biography. She's always been sensitive, she said. Our family tried everything to help. The officers' wives nodded again. One of them glanced at me with something close to pity. I almost smiled. People always think silence means weakness. In reality, silence is just data collection. My eyes drifted back to Vance. He was telling another story now. Something about international shipping permits. Everyone laughed. While they did, I quietly replayed the numbers in my head. 7 digits. Clear. Memorized. Device serial number. I had spent the last 8 years training my brain to store details like that automatically. Once you learn the habit, it becomes hard to turn off. Kelsey finally glanced over and noticed I was watching. She smiled at me from across the room. Not a friendly smile, a satisfied one. In her mind, she had just finished explaining my entire life to the room. Former soldier, unstable, unemployed, family burden. A clean little summary. She raised her glass toward me in a small mocking toast. I returned the gesture with my empty water glass. She turned back to her audience. Conversation continued. Music started again near the stage. Waiters carried fresh trays of drinks across the carpet. The retirement party moved forward like nothing unusual had happened. And in a way, nothing had. My sister believed she had just told the room the story of my failure. What she didn't know was that while she was talking, I had already memorized the serial number on her husband's satellite phone. And that number was the first piece of evidence that would eventually put him in federal prison for the rest of his life. I slid my access badge into the reader and waited for the second lock to click. The heavy door opened with a slow hydraulic hiss. Inside, the SCIF looked exactly the way most people imagine secret rooms in Washington, quiet, cold, and full of machines that never sleep. Rows of server racks hummed along the back wall. Blue indicator lights blinked like tiny signals in the dark. The air smelled like metal coffee and the kind of recycled air that never sees sunlight. I stepped in and the door sealed behind me. No phones allowed, no outside signals, no accidental leaks. Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. Most people just call it a SCIF. I dropped my bag on the desk, sat down in front of 3 monitors, and logged in. 48 hours had passed since my father's retirement party. 48 hours since my sister explained my mental instability to a room full of officers' wives. I typed the first command. The system responded with a clean prompt. Good. I reached into my memory and entered the 7 digits I had memorized at the party. The serial number from Vance's satellite phone. 7 digits can open a surprising number of doors when you know which databases to ask. The search began running across 3 networks. Military Communications Registry, International Satellite Provider Logs, Financial Intelligence Cross-Reference. While the system worked, I took a sip from the coffee sitting beside my keyboard. Black. No sugar. 2 seconds later, the first results appeared. Device registration. The phone wasn't registered under Vance's name. That was expected. It belonged to a logistics company called Harbor Transit Solutions. I opened a new window and pulled their corporate records. Registered in Delaware, standard move. 3 employees listed. Revenue last year, $14 million. Interesting. I leaned closer to the screen. Then I opened the ownership structure. And there she was, Kelsey Caldwell, my sister, listed as the managing partner. I leaned back in my chair and let out a quiet breath. That didn't surprise me either. Kelsey had always liked being in charge of money she didn't earn. The real question was where that $14 million actually came from. I ran another query. Shipping contracts, Department of Defense vendor registry. The system pulled up the record Vance had bragged about at the party. Medical transport logistics. Contract value $12 million. I opened the shipment logs. 14 deliveries listed. Dates matched. Departure ports matched. But something else didn't. The cargo confirmation reports were incomplete. 3 shipments had full documentation. The other 11 had gaps. Missing confirmation signatures. Missing receiving officer IDs. That's the kind of detail most auditors ignore. I don't. I opened the tracking data from the satellite phone. The system mapped its location history across the last 6 months. A digital line started forming across the screen. Virginia, Florida, Puerto Rico. Then it went somewhere strange. Panama. I zoomed in. The phone had spent 9 hours inside a shipping port in Cologne. Not a normal stop for U.S. military medical equipment. I pulled the customs data. The screen filled with paperwork, container numbers, cargo declarations, receiver companies, and suddenly the pattern snapped into place. The shipments weren't reaching their listed military hospitals. They were disappearing halfway through the route. Redirected, sold. Black market medical equipment moves fast when wars and shortages start hitting hospitals around the world. Vance wasn't transporting supplies, he was stealing them. I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I opened the financial records. Wire transfers appeared next, large ones, 6 figures at a time, all routed through Harbor Transit Solutions, then filtered again through 3 smaller companies. I clicked the ownership records for the first shell company. Registered owner, Kelsey Caldwell. Second company, Kelsey Caldwell. Third company, also Kelsey. I rubbed my forehead and laughed once under my breath. My sister had always loved shortcuts. Apparently she liked criminal ones too. The laundering path was sloppy. Anyone serious about hiding money would have buried it deeper. But criminals who think they're smarter than everyone else rarely do that. They get lazy, which is how they end up in prison. I tagged the files and forwarded them to the secure case folder. Then another alert appeared on the screen. New document flagged, encrypted email, intercepted 2 weeks earlier through a federal financial monitoring program. Sender Vance Mercer, receiver Dr. Leonard Gordon. I recognized the name instantly. Dr. Gordon ran a psychiatric clinic in Maryland. And he had a quiet reputation among certain wealthy families. If you needed a convenient diagnosis during a messy divorce or inheritance fight, Gordon had a way of helping, for the right price. I opened the email. The message was short, direct. Need evaluation documentation prepared in advance. Conservatorship filing expected within the month. Subject Sloan Caldwell. Payment arranged through Harbor account. For a second, the room felt colder. I read the next email in the thread. This one came from Kelsey. We just need the paperwork to show she's unstable and unable to manage finances. Judge will sign if the medical report is clean. Attached file, draft psychiatric evaluation. My name sat at the top. Patient Sloan Caldwell diagnosis section. Delusional thinking, paranoia, impaired decision-making, recommended action, involuntary financial conservatorship. I stared at the screen for a long moment. $2 million. That's the size of the trust fund my grandfather left me before he died. My sister had never liked that. Apparently she had found a way to fix the problem. Declare me mentally incompetent. Take legal control of the trust. Use the money to patch the hole Vance had created in their little logistics empire. I leaned back in the chair again and crossed my arms. The hum of the servers filled the room. For most people, discovering their family plan to legally declare them insane would cause a meltdown, crying, anger, something dramatic. I just looked back at the screen. Then I opened one more window. Federal Financial Enforcement System. Restricted access. I typed in my credentials. The system accepted them immediately. Case authority level confirmed. A map of connected bank accounts appeared. Harbor Transit Solutions. The 3 shell companies. 2 personal accounts belonging to Vance. 1 belonging to Kelsey. Total available balance across the network. $12,482,991. I rested my hand on the keyboard. My family planned to use my mental health as a weapon. That was creative. Cruel. But creative. Unfortunately for them, they had a small problem. If they wanted to take my money, they needed a judge to sign the conservatorship order. And judges tend to ask questions when federal investigations suddenly appear in the same paperwork. I moved the cursor across the screen. One command box waited at the bottom of the system window. The label read Emergency Asset Control Authorization. Most people never see that button. I do. My finger hovered over the key for a second. Then I smiled. My family was preparing to drag me into court and prove I couldn't manage my own life. That meant we were all about to have a very interesting hearing. Because the moment they filed that petition, their financial records would land in the same courtroom. And right now, my finger was resting on the command that could freeze every dollar they had on the planet. The knock on my apartment door came right in the middle of my second cup of coffee. Not a polite knock. 3 hard hits against the wood, the kind that assumes authority. I glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall. 8:12 a.m., too early for salespeople, too aggressive for neighbors. I walked to the door and opened it. My father stood there first. Colonel Arthur Caldwell retired 2 days ago and already acting like he still commanded a battalion. Behind him stood my mother, Linda, clutching her purse with both hands. And beside her was Kelsey. Perfect hair, soft makeup, a concerned expression that deserved an award. I stepped aside without saying anything. They walked in like they owned the place. My apartment isn't impressive. Small living room, 1 bedroom. Government contractor salary doesn't stretch very far in Arlington if you also like sleeping indoors. My father looked around the room with open disappointment. "This is where you live?" he asked. "Yes." He shook his head slowly, like he had just confirmed something tragic. Kelsey sat down on my couch without asking. My mother stayed standing near the door. Nobody smiled. My father turned toward the dining table. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a request. I pulled out a chair and sat. He remained standing for another second, like he was deciding how much patience he planned to spend this morning. Then he reached into a leather folder he had been carrying. He dropped a thick stack of papers on the table. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "Sign it," he said. "I didn't touch the papers yet." "What is it?" He stared at me like I had just asked the dumbest question in the world. "It's a conservatorship agreement." My mother looked at the floor. Kelsey sniffed softly beside her. My father continued. "You've been struggling for years, Sloan. Everyone sees it. Your instability, your poor decisions." I kept my hands folded on the table. He tapped the papers with 2 fingers. "This allows your sister to manage your finances." Kelsey lowered her eyes modestly. "I didn't want to do this," she said quietly. "But someone has to help you." I almost admired the performance. Almost. My father leaned forward slightly. "Your grandfather left you $2 million, he said. "And you've clearly proven you can't handle that kind of responsibility." I blinked slowly. "You think I'm spending it?" He didn't hesitate. "Your behavior is erratic. Your career collapsed. You isolate yourself. You don't talk to your family." I nodded. "Those are terrible crimes." His jaw tightened. "Don't be sarcastic." Kelsey reached across the table and touched my arm. Her voice softened. "Sloan, we're trying to protect you." I glanced down at the stack of documents. Psychiatric evaluation, financial management transfer, legal authority request, all cleanly organized. Someone had prepared this carefully. I slid the first page closer, and there it was, Dr. Leonard Gordon. His signature sat neatly at the bottom of the medical report, exactly where I expected it. The diagnosis paragraph looked familiar: delusional thinking, paranoia, impaired judgment. I had read the exact wording 2 days earlier inside the SCIF. Apparently, Dr. Gordon liked copy and paste. I let my fingers rest on the edge of the paper. Kelsey leaned forward, watching my face carefully. "See," she said softly. "A doctor already evaluated everything. This is just paperwork." My father pushed a pen across the table toward me. "Sign it voluntarily, and this stays simple." I picked up the pen, and then I let my hand shake. Just a little. Kelsey noticed immediately. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Good. Fear was the emotion she expected. I lowered my eyes to the document again. "You think I'm insane," I said quietly. Nobody answered. My mother finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "We just want you safe." I stared at the diagnosis line again. Delusional thinking. If only the doctor knew how accurate that word was. Just not in the direction he thought. My father pointed at the signature line. "Sign it, Sloan. Let your sister manage things before you destroy the money your grandfather left." Kelsey squeezed my arm again. "You won't have to worry about anything," she said. I slowly put the pen down. "I can't sign this." My father's face hardened immediately. "This isn't optional. It is if I'm legally competent." Kelsey inhaled sharply. "You're proving the doctor's point right now." I leaned back slightly in my chair. "I don't agree with the evaluation." My father's voice dropped lower. "That evaluation came from a licensed psychiatrist." "Yes," I said. "A very expensive one." Silence hung over the table for a few seconds. Then my father grabbed the documents and flipped through them. "You don't get to argue with medical science." I nodded slowly. "You're right." Kelsey watched me carefully again. She was trying to read something in my face, trying to figure out whether I was about to explode. Instead, I let my voice get smaller. I'm just not ready to give up control of my life. My father slammed the folder shut. Then we'll do this the legal way. There it was. Exactly the sentence I had been waiting for. Kelsey stood up from the couch and walked toward the door. Her expression changed the moment she thought my back was turned. The concern disappeared. In its place came satisfaction. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said. I looked down at the papers again and didn't answer. My father moved toward the door as well. "This will go before a judge," he said. "And once the court sees the medical evaluation, they'll sign the order whether you like it or not." My mother finally looked at me. Her voice was tired. "You should have signed." I stayed quiet. The three of them walked out of the apartment. The door closed behind them. For a few seconds, the room stayed completely still. Then I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, Kelsey and my father stood beside their car. Kelsey laughed at something he said. She looked relaxed, victorious. She believed the hunt was over. She thought I had just refused out of fear. What she didn't realize was that the moment she filed that conservatorship petition in federal court, every financial record connected to her husband's company would enter the same legal system. And federal investigators love paperwork. Kelsey climbed into the passenger seat and gave one last satisfied smile toward my building before the car pulled away. She looked exactly like a hunter walking away from a trapped animal. What she didn't understand was that I had just opened the cage door myself and invited her to step inside a trap she would never escape. I watched their car disappear down the street and closed the blinds. The apartment felt quiet again. Quiet is useful when you're planning something. I walked back to the table and picked up the stack of conservatorship documents they had left behind. Dr. Gordon's signature stared up at me from the bottom of the page. Clean ink, clean lie. I folded the paper once, then set it aside. The court filing came 3 days later. Federal District Court. Petition for conservatorship. Filed by Kelsey Caldwell. Medical justification attached. Exactly on schedule. That's the thing about people who think they're smarter than everyone else. They follow their own plan perfectly. They never imagine someone else already mapped it. By the time the court notification landed in my inbox, my investigation file already had 72 pages. Shipping records, wire transfers, shell companies, satellite phone logs. The only thing missing was timing. Timing matters. You can have all the evidence in the world, but if you move too early, criminals panic and disappear. Move too late and the money is gone. So I waited. 1 week. Just long enough for Kelsey to feel confident. Just long enough for Vance to start celebrating. On Thursday afternoon, I sat in my office at the Pentagon Annex. Not a dramatic office. 2 monitors, gray desk, a coffee mug that had been washed so many times the logo faded off. I leaned back in the chair and opened the Federal Financial Enforcement System. The same window I had left open days earlier appeared again. Networked accounts, Harbor Transit Solutions, 3 shell companies, 2 personal accounts belonging to Vance, 1 belonging to Kelsey. Balance totals scrolled down the screen. Just over $12 million still moving through the network. The cursor blinked inside the command box. I took a sip of coffee. Black, no sugar. Then I typed 1 line, execute asset freeze authorization. I didn't rush the next step. I just rested my finger on the key for a second. Then I pressed enter. The system processed the command. 5 seconds later, the confirmation window appeared. Emergency asset control initiated status active. Every account connected to that network locked instantly. Cards stopped working, transfers stopped processing. The financial system treats frozen money like it suddenly doesn't exist. I closed the window, then I opened another screen. Satellite phone tracking. Vance's device lit up immediately. Location Tyson's Corner. I smiled. Tyson's Corner meant one thing, shopping. I leaned back and pulled the live retail monitoring feed from the bank network. It took 30 seconds to find the transaction attempt. High-end jewelry store, diamond necklace, price $80,000. I could almost see the scene without being there. But the audio feed from the bank call center made it even better. Vance's voice exploded through the recording. "What do you mean declined?" A young sales clerk answered nervously. "Sir, the card terminal says the transaction was rejected." "That's impossible," Vance snapped. "Run it again." Keyboard clicks. The clerk tried again. Another error tone. "Sir, it's still declining." I could hear Kelsey's voice in the background. "What's going on?" Vance grabbed the phone. Give me your manager. A pause. Then the manager spoke. Mr. Mercer, the system is showing a restriction on the account. What kind of restriction, sir? It appears to be frozen. Silence filled the line for half a second. Then Vance exploded. That's ridiculous. I have over $10 million in that account. Yes, sir, the manager said carefully. But the system indicates a federal hold. Kelsey's voice cut in again. Let me talk to them. Fabric rustled as she grabbed the phone. Hello, there must be a mistake. The manager stayed polite. I recommend calling your bank directly, ma'am. A minute later, the call center connected them to the bank. The operator answered in a calm, professional voice. Financial services support. How can I help you today? Vance didn't bother with manners. Your system just declined an $80,000 purchase. The operator typed something. I see the account, sir. Then fix it. Another pause. The operator's tone changed slightly. Sir, your account is currently under federal asset control. What does that mean? It means the funds are frozen by who? By order of a federal financial task force. For the first time, Vance didn't have anything to say. The operator continued. All outgoing transactions are restricted until the hold is lifted. Kelsey's voice sounded tighter now. This is a banking error. I understand your concern, ma'am. How long until it's fixed? That depends on the federal agency involved. Silence again. Then Vance spoke slowly. You're telling me I can't use my own money. That is correct, sir. The call ended shortly after. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the monitor. Satellite tracking showed the phone still inside the jewelry store. Two small figures stood near the counter. One angry, one confused. They would spend the next few hours calling lawyers, bankers, and accountants. Every single one of them would tell the same story. Accounts frozen. Investigation pending. And eventually someone would mention the word audit. But criminals rarely accept the first explanation. They blame systems, clerks, temporary glitches. That's human nature. Vance and Kelsey would do the same. They would convince themselves this was a mistake, a routine financial review, something that would fix itself, because tomorrow was their real plan. Tomorrow they expected a court hearing that would give them legal control over $2 million from my grandfather's trust. In their minds, that money would stabilize everything, pay debts, plug financial holes, save the company. I closed the monitoring window and finished the rest of my coffee. Across the city, Vance and Kelsey were probably standing in that jewelry store blaming the bank for embarrassing them. They would go home tonight angry, but confident. They would tell themselves the system would correct the error by morning. They believed tomorrow would be the day they finally took my money. What they didn't understand was that tomorrow wasn't the day they were getting rich. Tomorrow was the day their entire operation would collapse in a courtroom. I straightened the sleeve of my black jacket and stepped out of the car in front of the federal courthouse. Morning air in Washington has a specific smell. Concrete traffic and government paperwork moving through buildings that never really sleep. The courthouse stood quiet and heavy in front of me. Tall columns, wide steps, security cameras everywhere. I adjusted the collar of my jacket and walked toward the entrance. The suit I wore that morning didn't come from a luxury store. No designer logo, no fancy lining, just clean black fabric and sharp stitching. It did exactly what I needed it to do. Make me invisible. Inside the lobby, the security line moved slowly. Lawyers carried briefcases. A few reporters waited near the metal detectors, hoping something interesting might happen that day. I placed my bag in the tray and stepped through the scanner. No alarms. Good. Courtroom 3 was on the 4th floor. The elevator ride took about 20 seconds. Plenty of time to breathe. Plenty of time to review the plan one more time. When the doors opened, the hallway already looked busy. And standing near the courtroom doors was my family. Kelsey spotted me first. Her smile spread slowly across her face, like someone spotting a stray dog wandering into the wrong neighborhood. She looked confident, too confident. Red designer dress, gold bracelet, hair styled perfectly. Next to her stood Vance, in a dark suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. And behind them stood my parents. My father looked stiff and impatient. My mother looked like she wished she were anywhere else. 3 lawyers stood nearby reviewing documents. Expensive ones. You can tell by how relaxed they look in federal buildings. Kelsey leaned toward one of them and whispered something. The lawyer glanced at me for half a second and nodded like the outcome of today's hearing had already been decided. I kept walking. No hesitation. No greeting. When I reached the courtroom doors, Kelsey stepped forward and blocked my path. "Morning, Sloan." Her tone sounded cheerful, like she was greeting someone at brunch. I stopped. "Morning." She tilted her head slightly and studied my face. "You came alone?" "Yes." She let out a small laugh. "That's brave." Vance stood beside her with his arms crossed. He didn't bother pretending to be polite. "Still think this is a joke," he said. I looked at him calmly. "No," he smiled. "Good. Confidence makes people careless." Kelsey stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Listen," she said quietly. "You don't have to make today difficult." I waited. Her perfume smelled expensive. "Just sign the agreement," she continued. "We can still keep this private." "Private, yes," she said softly. "No courtroom drama, no embarrassing testimony." I looked past her toward the courtroom doors. "Sounds peaceful." She leaned even closer. "If you cooperate," she whispered, "I'll let you stay in the basement of our house." I blinked once. She continued, "Just until you get stable again." Vance chuckled beside her. Kelsey glanced briefly toward our parents. "Mom and Dad are exhausted," she said. "They're tired of dealing with your episodes." Episodes. Interesting word. I nodded slowly. "That must be difficult." Kelsey smiled again. "You have no idea." For a moment, we just stood there. She was waiting for a reaction. Anger, panic, something emotional. Instead, I lowered my eyes slightly and adjusted the crease on my jacket sleeve. A small movement. Precise. While I did that, my right hand brushed lightly against my hair. Hidden just inside the strands sat a small communications earpiece. Almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. My finger tapped it once. A quiet voice responded immediately. "Command ready." I kept my face neutral. "Target in position," I murmured under my breath. "Copy." The voice on the line stayed calm. "Team standing by." I shifted my sleeve again and gave a final confirmation. "Prepare to close." "Understood." The line went silent. I lowered my hand and looked back at Kelsey. She had no idea any of that just happened. To her, it looked like I had simply fixed my hair. Kelsey stepped back and smoothed the front of her dress. "Last chance," she said. I didn't answer. She shrugged lightly and turned toward the lawyers. "Well," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "we tried to help her." One of the attorneys checked his watch. "The judge will call us in shortly." Vance leaned toward Kelsey. "Don't worry," he said. "This will be over in 10 minutes. Kelsey smiled. "Oh, I know." My father finally looked at me directly. "This didn't have to happen," he said. I met his eyes. "You're right." He waited for more. I didn't give it to him. The courtroom doors opened and the bailiff stepped out. All parties for the Caldwell conservatorship hearing. Kelsey inhaled slowly and lifted her chin. For a moment, she looked exactly like someone about to accept an award. She turned toward the courtroom entrance and smoothed the fabric of her designer dress one last time. The lawyers gathered their folders. Vance adjusted his tie. My parents followed behind them. Kelsey walked toward the courtroom doors like a queen approaching her throne. Confident, relaxed, certain the day belonged to her. She believed the hearing would give her control over my finances. She believed the judge would sign the conservatorship papers. She believed the worst part of her week had been a temporary banking error. What she didn't know was that the person waiting behind that judge's bench wasn't a normal civil court official. And in about 5 minutes, the entire room was going to find out exactly who I worked for. I pulled out the chair at the defense table and sat down without saying a word. The courtroom felt colder than the hallway outside. Federal rooms always do. Everything inside them is designed for order, straight lines, hardwood, quiet rules. Kelsey and her legal team sat across from me. 3 lawyers, 1 paralegal, stacks of folders that looked thick enough to impress a jury. My side of the table held exactly 2 things, a notepad and a pen. The bailiff closed the courtroom doors behind us. A few observers sat in the back row, probably law students, maybe a reporter hoping for something interesting to happen. Conservatorship hearings are usually boring. Today wouldn't be. The judge's chair behind the bench remained empty for the moment. That was normal. Court clerks shuffled paperwork while the attorneys organized their notes. Kelsey leaned slightly toward Vance and whispered something that made him grin. Confidence again. I folded my hands together on the table and waited. Finally, the bailiff spoke. "All rise." Everyone stood. The door behind the bench opened. A man in a black judicial robe walked in and took his seat. Judge Halverson, civil court judge. Temporary assignment today. Exactly the person Kelsey expected. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file in front of him. Be seated. Chairs moved across the room as everyone sat again. The judge glanced at the paperwork. Petition for conservatorship regarding Ms. Sloane Caldwell. He looked up. Counsel for the petitioner, you may proceed. Kelsey's lead attorney stood smoothly. He was the kind of lawyer who looked like he practiced smiling in mirrors. Your Honor, he began. This is an unfortunate case involving a young woman who has struggled with serious mental health challenges. His voice sounded calm and professional, carefully rehearsed. My client, Ms. Kelsey Caldwell, has stepped forward only out of concern for her sister's well-being. He gestured lightly toward Kelsey. She lowered her eyes and folded her hands together. Perfect performance, the lawyer continued. Ms. Sloane Caldwell previously served in the military, but her career ended early due to psychological instability. A few heads in the audience turned toward me. I stayed still. He flipped a page in his folder. Since her discharge, Ms. Caldwell has shown signs of delusional thinking, paranoia, and erratic decision-making. Another page turned. She currently has no stable career and has isolated herself from family support. He paused for effect. Our concern is simple. Without intervention, Ms. Caldwell may harm herself or squander the $2 million trust left to her by her grandfather. He stepped back slightly. For that reason, we request the court grant temporary financial conservatorship to her sister, Ms. Kelsey Caldwell. The judge nodded once. Thank you, counsel. The lawyer turned toward my side of the room. Your Honor, we would also like to submit medical documentation confirming Ms. Caldwell's condition. A folder slid across the clerk's desk. Dr. Gordon's name sat neatly on the front page. The judge scanned the report briefly, then he looked toward the witness stand. Call your first witness. Kelsey's attorney nodded. The petitioner calls Colonel Arthur Caldwell. My father stood and walked to the stand. His posture remained straight. Military habits don't disappear easily. He raised his right hand, swore the oath, and sat down. The lawyer approached him. Colonel Caldwell, could you explain your concerns regarding your daughter? My father didn't hesitate. Sloane has always been difficult, he said. The room stayed quiet. Her behavior became unstable during her time in the army. He glanced toward me briefly. She refused help, refused guidance. Eventually, the military had no choice but to discharge her. The lawyer nodded sympathetically. How has that affected your family? My father's jaw tightened. It's embarrassing, he looked toward the judge. I spent 40 years serving this country. My reputation matters. A pause. My daughter's behavior has brought shame to our family. Kelsey lowered her head slightly beside the witness stand. Her hand moved to her purse. She pulled out a white handkerchief. The lawyer asked another question. Colonel, do you believe your older daughter Kelsey is capable of managing the financial matters responsibly? Absolutely, my father said. Kelsey has always been reliable. Kelsey dabbed her eyes carefully. Slow, controlled. I watched the whole performance, every movement, every pause. The lawyer finished with my father and called the next witness, Kelsey herself. She stepped onto the stand like someone walking onto a stage, hand on the Bible, oath taken. Then she sat. Her voice trembled slightly when she began speaking. I never wanted this situation, she said. Her eyes glistened as she looked toward the judge. Sloane is my little sister. She paused to wipe an imaginary tear. I just want her to be safe. The courtroom stayed silent while she built the story. She's been paranoid for years, Kelsey continued. She thinks people are watching her, investigating her. That line almost made me smile. Almost. She doesn't trust anyone, Kelsey said. Another soft sniff. I'm afraid she'll ruin her life. The lawyer placed a gentle hand on the edge of the witness stand. You're only asking to manage her finances. Yes, Kelsey said quietly, just until she gets better. More paper rustled as the attorney stepped back. Your Honor, the petitioner rests. The judge nodded slowly. Miss Caldwell, he said, looking toward me. This is your opportunity to respond. Every face in the courtroom turned in my direction. I didn't move. My hands stayed folded together on the table. My expression stayed neutral. No anger, no fear, no reaction at all. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The silence grew heavier. Even the lawyers shifted slightly in their chairs. Kelsey watched me carefully. Her eyes narrowed just a little. She was trying to understand something, trying to figure out why I wasn't panicking. My father stared at me with open irritation. The judge waited patiently. Still, I said nothing. Because silence is a very useful tool. In interrogation rooms, silence does something interesting. It makes liars uncomfortable. They start talking more than they planned. They add details, they exaggerate, they build their own trap. Kelsey finally leaned toward her lawyer and whispered something. She thought my silence meant surrender. She thought I had accepted the story they built. What she didn't understand was that in questioning and investigation, silence isn't weakness. Silence is the rope that lets a liar tie their own knot. I kept my hands folded on the table and said nothing. The silence stretched longer than anyone in the room expected. 20 seconds? 30? The judge glanced down at the paperwork again, then back up at me. Ms. Caldwell, he said calmly. This is your opportunity to respond to the petition. I didn't move. Across the room, Kelsey's lawyer shifted in his chair. He leaned toward her and whispered something under his breath. Kelsey nodded once, but I could see the tension building in her shoulders. Silence has a way of doing that. It makes people nervous, especially people who are used to being in control of the conversation. My father sat stiffly behind the witness stand. His eyes burned into the side of my face, like he wanted to physically push words out of my mouth. I kept looking straight ahead. The judge spoke again. Ms. Caldwell, still nothing. From the corner of my eye, I saw Kelsey's expression change. Confusion first, then irritation, then something sharper. She leaned forward in her chair and whispered something to her lawyer again. He shook his head slightly, probably telling her to stay calm, probably telling her the judge would rule soon, but Kelsey had never been good at waiting. Another 10 seconds passed, and then she snapped. The chair scraped loudly across the floor as she stood up. Her lawyer reached for her arm. Kelsey, too late. She stepped forward and pointed directly at me. Look at her. Her voice echoed through the courtroom. Every head turned. She's not even responding. Her fingers stayed locked in my direction. This is exactly what we've been talking about. The judge raised his hand. Ms. Caldwell, please sit down. But she wasn't listening anymore. Her voice grew louder. Look at her face. She's completely detached from reality. My father shifted in his chair. Kelsey. But she had momentum now, and people with momentum rarely stop. She's insane, Kelsey shouted. Gasps moved quietly through the back rows of the courtroom. She's a paranoid failure who thinks everyone is after her. Her arm cut through the air as she pointed at me again. She doesn't deserve to control $2 million. The judge hit the gavel once. Ms. Caldwell, that is enough. But Kelsey kept going. Freeze her accounts, she yelled. Give the money to someone responsible. Her voice cracked with anger. She's not fit to live in society. For a second, the entire courtroom froze. No one moved. No one spoke. The echo of her voice bounced against the wood-paneled walls. Then something else happened. Behind the judge's bench, the oak door opened, slowly. The sound of heavy hinges filled the room. Everyone turned their heads. 2 military police officers stepped inside first. They wore dark uniforms and serious expressions. The room went quiet in a different way now. The kind of quiet that means something unexpected just entered the building. Then the man behind them stepped forward. He wore a military dress uniform, 4 stars on his shoulders, tall, gray hair, posture so straight it looked carved out of stone. General Harrison, Judge Advocate General of the United States Armed Forces. Even the judge behind the bench blinked in surprise. The general walked forward calmly. The 2 military police officers stopped a few feet behind him. No one spoke, not the lawyers, not my father, not Kelsey. The general reached the front of the bench and nodded once to the judge. Quiet respect, professional courtesy. Then he turned his head slowly toward Kelsey. She still stood in the middle of the courtroom, arm halfway raised, expression frozen. For the first time that morning, she looked uncertain. General Harrison studied her for a moment. Not angry, just curious. Then he spoke. His voice was low, calm, but it carried across the entire room without effort. Ms. Caldwell, Kelsey swallowed. Yes. The general tilted his head slightly toward me. You just called that officer insane. The word officer landed in the room like a dropped weight. A few people turned toward me again. Kelsey frowned. What? The general continued. Let me ask you a question. His tone didn't change. Still calm, still steady. Do you know who she works for? The courtroom went completely silent. Not the normal courtroom silence. The kind that feels thick, heavy. The judge behind the bench leaned forward slightly. The lawyers stopped moving. My father looked from the general to me like someone trying to solve a puzzle too late. Kelsey blinked. She doesn't work for anyone. General Harrison raised one eyebrow. Is that your understanding? Kelsey's confidence started slipping. She was discharged from the army. The general looked at me briefly, then back at her. Was she? No one spoke. The question hung in the air. Kelsey opened her mouth slightly. Nothing came out. The general's voice remained calm. Interesting. He turned slightly toward the judge's bench. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to clarify something for the record. The judge nodded slowly. Please do. General Harrison looked back at Kelsey one more time. Then he spoke the sentence that changed everything in that room. The woman you are attempting to declare mentally incompetent is not unemployed. He paused just long enough for everyone to pay attention. She is currently serving as a senior forensic audit director assigned to the Department of Defense. The words moved through the courtroom like a shockwave. Kelsey's face went completely pale. And for the first time since this entire hearing began, someone finally understood why I hadn't said a single word. The silence after General Harrison's statement lasted about 3 seconds. It felt longer. Kelsey stood frozen in the middle of the courtroom, still halfway turned toward me. Her mouth opened slightly like she was about to argue. Nothing came out. General Harrison didn't wait for her to recover. He stepped forward and placed a thick folder on the judge's bench. The stamp on the front was bright red, classified. Even from across the room, everyone could see it. The judge looked down at the file, then back up at the general. General Harrison spoke calmly. Your Honor, for the record. Captain Sloan Caldwell is currently assigned as a senior forensic audit director working under Department of Defense Financial Investigations. The judge blinked once. I could see the moment the room recalculated everything it thought it knew. General Harrison continued. She is not here as a defendant. He turned his head toward Vance. She is here as the lead investigator in an active criminal case. Vance's smile disappeared instantly. Kelsey stared at the general like he had just started speaking another language. General Harrison rested one hand on the folder. The investigation concerns large-scale theft and illegal resale of U.S. military medical equipment. He paused briefly. Specifically equipment transported under a $12 million logistics contract. Now Vance looked nervous, not confused. Nervous. People who know they're innocent look confused. People who know exactly what's coming start calculating exits. Unfortunately for him, federal courtrooms don't have exits for that situation. General Harrison finished the sentence. And the primary suspect in that investigation is Mr. Vance Mercer. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the courtroom doors exploded open. The sound echoed against the wood walls like a gunshot. 6 federal agents rushed inside. 3 wearing FBI jackets. 3 wearing CID badges from the Army Criminal Investigation Division. Everything that happened next moved fast. One agent crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed Vance's arms before he could even stand. His sentence ended when the agent forced him face first onto the wooden table. Another agent pulled his wrists behind his back. The metal click of handcuffs cut through the room. Sharp, final, Kelsey screamed. What are you doing? 2 more agents moved toward her, not aggressively, just blocking any chance she might interfere. My father stood up suddenly. This is outrageous. An FBI agent turned toward him calmly. Sir, please remain seated. Vance struggled once against the table. It lasted about half a second. The agent holding his shoulder didn't even look strained. You are under arrest, the agent said flatly, for conspiracy fraud against the United States government and trafficking of stolen military medical equipment. The room had gone completely silent again, except for Kelsey. This is insane, she yelled. Her voice cracked as she pointed toward me again. This is her fault. She's the one who's crazy. General Harrison didn't react. The judge watched everything with quiet disbelief. Vance finally stopped struggling. That usually happens when people realize they're not getting out of the room. One of the agents began reading the formal arrest statement. Kelsey's breathing grew louder. Her entire world had just tilted sideways, and she still didn't understand why. That was my cue. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood up. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward me again. For the first time that morning, I spoke. My voice sounded calm, almost casual. Your Honor, I said, may I approach? The judge nodded automatically. I walked toward the center table where Vance was still pinned down by 2 federal agents. Then I reached inside my jacket and pulled out a thin document folder. I set it on the table. Inside were two things: bank transfer records and Dr. Gordon's psychiatric report. I opened the folder and slid the papers across the wood surface toward Kelsey. Her hands shook slightly as she looked down. The first page showed the Shell Company network, Harbor Transit Solutions, 3 offshore holding companies. Every ownership line connected back to her. Her lips parted slowly. The next page showed wire transfers, millions moving through accounts, then freezing. Red letters stamped across the bottom. Assets locked by federal order. Kelsey looked up at me. Her face had lost all color. "This isn't real." I nodded slightly. "You said I was paranoid." Her breathing got faster. "You said I imagined people investigating you." She shook her head weakly. "No," I pointed at the paperwork. "I froze your accounts last Tuesday morning." The room stayed silent. $12 million. Kelsey's eyes widened. "Gone." Vance lifted his head slightly from the table. "You can't do that." I looked at him. "Yes," I said calmly. "I can." I picked up the second document. Dr. Gordon's psychiatric report. Fake diagnosis. Fake evaluation. Fake authority. I placed it on top of the financial records. "You also hired a doctor to declare me mentally incompetent." Kelsey's voice cracked. "That's not," I tapped the paper once. "Payment came from Harbor Transit Solutions." Her mouth closed again. I leaned slightly closer to her. "You were right about one thing, though." She stared at me. "I am paranoid." I let the sentence hang for a second. "Paranoid enough to audit every dollar connected to your husband's company." I straightened again. Turns out that was a good instinct. Across the room, the FBI agents lifted Vance off the table and began escorting him toward the door. The handcuffs clinked softly as he moved. Kelsey turned suddenly toward our parents. "Dad." Her voice sounded smaller now, almost desperate. My father didn't move. The truth does something interesting to family loyalty. It removes the excuses. Kelsey looked from him to my mother. "Mom," no one answered. Because once $12 million of stolen military equipment appears in a federal investigation, family arguments stop being family problems. They become prison sentences. Kelsey's knees nearly buckled. One of the agents stepped forward and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You'll need to come with us as well, ma'am." Her head snapped back toward me. This time there was no anger in her face, just disbelief. "What did you do?" I didn't answer, because by that point the evidence on the table had already said everything that needed to be said. And in that courtroom with her husband in handcuffs and her accounts frozen, the power she had built with money and manipulation finally disappeared. Family ties don't mean much once the money holding them together evaporates. The agents pulled Vance toward the courtroom doors first. He didn't fight anymore. That's another thing people learn quickly when federal agents show up with paperwork already signed. Fighting just makes the walk to prison longer. His hands were cuffed behind his back. The metal chain between the cuffs rattled softly each time he took a step. Kelsey stood frozen for a moment before 2 agents guided her forward as well. She looked smaller now. The confidence she walked in with had evaporated somewhere between the words "federal investigation" and the sound of handcuffs closing. "Wait," she said weakly. One of the agents shook his head. "Ma'am, you'll have the opportunity to speak with your attorney." Her eyes darted around the room like she was looking for something solid to hold on to. "They landed on our father, Dad," she said. Arthur Caldwell sat completely still in his chair. For the first time in my life, he looked unsure of what to do. Kelsey tried again. "Dad." He didn't move. The agents escorted her past the table where the evidence folder still sat open. Bank transfers, shell companies, frozen accounts, a financial autopsy. Kelsey looked at the papers like they might suddenly rearrange themselves into a better story. They didn't. The agents led both of them out of the courtroom. The doors closed behind them with a heavy thud. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. The judge cleared his throat quietly. "Well," he said. He looked down at the conservatorship petition one more time. Then he closed the folder. "I believe this petition is no longer relevant." The courtroom clerk nodded quickly. The judge looked toward me. "Captain Caldwell, it appears the situation has changed." "That would be accurate, Your Honor." He nodded once. "This court will dismiss the conservatorship request." He glanced toward the door where Kelsey had just disappeared. "And I suspect federal prosecutors will be very busy this afternoon." The gavel tapped once. Hearing adjourned, chairs began moving around the room. The lawyers who had arrived so confident earlier packed their folders quietly now. Nobody looked at me. They didn't need to. Lawyers recognize the moment when a case collapses. General Harrison remained standing near the bench. He gave the judge a short nod of professional thanks before stepping down from the front of the room. I gathered my folder from the table and slipped it back into my jacket. The observers in the back rows whispered to each other while filing out. News travels fast inside courthouses. But before I could leave, someone grabbed my arm. My father, his grip was tight. Sloan, I turned slowly. Up close, he looked older than he had that morning. His posture had lost its stiffness. Wait, he said. My mother stood beside him, her hands twisting nervously together. Arthur's voice shook slightly. You're the one in charge of this. I didn't answer. He glanced toward the courtroom doors again, like he could still see Kelsey being led away. You can fix this. I watched him carefully. Fix what? He lowered his voice. Your sister. The word sounded strange coming from him now. 10 minutes earlier, she had been the responsible daughter, the stable one. Now she needed rescuing. She made mistakes, he said quickly. People make mistakes. I nodded once. Yes. He leaned closer. But you're the one with authority here. His hand tightened on my sleeve. You can talk to them. You can explain. My mother finally spoke. Sloan, please. Her voice sounded fragile. We're family. That sentence always arrives right after the damage. Family, the emergency word people use when consequences finally show up. Arthur continued. You have influence, he said. You have connections. He looked at me like I was the last lifeboat on a sinking ship. You need to help her. For a moment I just studied his face. 40 years in the army. A man who spent his life talking about honor and discipline. And now he was asking me to bend federal law because the criminal happened to share his last name. I reached into my jacket slowly. Arthur watched my hand like he expected a phone, or maybe a badge. Instead, I pulled out a single sheet of paper. The psychiatric evaluation, Dr. Gordon's signature at the bottom, the same document they had brought to my apartment, the same document they expected me to sign. I folded it once. Then I reached forward and slid it into the front pocket of my father's jacket. He looked down at it, confused. Remember this, I asked. Neither of them answered. You came to my apartment with this paper, I said. You told me I was sick. My mother looked away. Arthur stayed quiet. You said I needed someone else to control my life. The courtroom had mostly emptied now. Only General Harrison remained near the aisle. I looked back at my parents. You didn't treat me like family when you thought I was weak. Arthur's jaw tightened. That's different. No, I said calmly. It isn't. I straightened my jacket sleeve again. Family isn't something you throw away when it stops being useful. The words hung in the air. Then demand it back the moment prison becomes a possibility. Arthur's hand slowly released my arm. For the first time that morning, he had nothing left to argue with. I turned away from them. General Harrison waited near the door. Ready to go, Captain? He asked. Yes, sir. We walked down the aisle together and pushed open the courthouse doors. Outside, the afternoon sun hit the steps in front of the building. Bright, warm, the city moved normally beyond the gates. Cars passing, people talking. Life continuing like nothing unusual had happened inside that courtroom. I stopped for a moment at the top of the steps. Behind me, through the open doorway, I could still see my parents standing inside the hallway. Small figures now. General Harrison adjusted his cap. You handled that well. Thank you, sir. He studied me briefly. Family cases are always the hardest. I looked back toward the courthouse entrance one last time. Not this one. Then I turned and walked down the steps into the sunlight. And behind me, the family that tried to bury me under lies was finally left alone with the consequences they built themselves. I stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps for a minute before walking away. Traffic moved normally on the street. People crossed the intersection. Someone argued with a parking meter like it had personally insulted them. Washington didn't care that someone's life had just collapsed inside that building. Cities rarely do. General Harrison stopped beside the government car waiting at the curb. You all right, Captain? He asked. Yes, sir. He studied my face for a second like he was checking whether that answer meant something or nothing. Then he nodded once. Take the afternoon off, he said. You've earned it. I'll finish the paperwork tomorrow. He gave a short smile. Of course you will. He stepped into the car and the driver pulled away. Just like that, the operation was over. No dramatic music, no celebration, no slow-motion victory walk. Just a quiet sidewalk and the feeling that something heavy had finally stopped sitting on my chest. I started walking. About 2 blocks later, I stopped at a small coffee shop I'd passed 100 times and never gone into. The place smelled like espresso and burnt bagels. I ordered black coffee and took a seat by the window. Across the street, people moved through their normal routines. A woman walked her dog. A man argued into a phone about something involving quarterly numbers. Life kept going. That's something movies never explain properly. Revenge doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like paperwork ending. I sat there for a while and thought about the last 2 weeks. My sister screaming in court, my father asking me to save the very people who tried to destroy me. And the strangest part wasn't the investigation. It was realizing how easy it had been for them to believe their own story about me. Kelsey believed I was weak. My father believed I was unstable. My mother believed I needed to be controlled. None of them ever stopped to ask whether they might be wrong. That's the dangerous thing about family. People think they know you. Sometimes they decide who you are long before you get the chance to become anything else. When that happens, they stop seeing reality. They only see the version of you that fits their expectations. Kelsey needed me to be the failure. If I wasn't the broken sister, then she wasn't the successful one. That comparison had been running in her head for years. She just didn't realize the scoreboard was fake. I took another sip of coffee and looked out the window. There's a phrase people love to repeat. Family is everything. It sounds nice. It fits on greeting cards. But life is a little more complicated than greeting cards. Family can be supportive. Family can also be manipulative. Sometimes the same people who say they love you are the first ones ready to control you when money gets involved. And money changes people faster than almost anything else. $2 million from my grandfather's trust fund wasn't enough to make my sister rich. But it was enough to make her desperate. Desperation leads people to justify things they would normally call immoral. Stealing military medical equipment, forging psychiatric evaluations, trying to legally declare someone insane. All of it probably sounded reasonable inside her own head. People rarely see themselves as villains. They see themselves as victims fixing a problem. I finished half the coffee and set the cup down. Another thing I learned from the situation is that anger is overrated. Everyone expects revenge stories to end with shouting, but anger makes you sloppy, and sloppy people lose investigations. The reason I won that courtroom wasn't because I yelled louder than Kelsey. It was because I waited longer than she could. Silence makes impatient people self-destruct. If you've ever watched an interrogation video, you'll see the same pattern. The guilty person can't stand quiet. They start talking, they start explaining, and eventually they build the case against themselves. Kelsey did the same thing. She walked into that courtroom convinced she was smarter than everyone else. Then she stood up and screamed the words that made the entire room question her credibility. She destroyed her own image in about 30 seconds. All I had to do was sit still. That might be the most useful skill anyone can learn. Patience, not passive patience. Strategic patience, the kind where you already know how things will end so you don't rush the middle. I checked the time on my phone. 3 missed calls from unknown numbers, probably reporters. News travels fast once federal agents show up in courtrooms. I turned the phone face down on the table. They could write whatever headlines they wanted. The truth didn't need commentary. After a few minutes, I finished the coffee and stood up. As I walked toward the door, one last thought crossed my mind. People think revenge is about hurting someone who hurt you. But the best kind of revenge is simpler. It's refusing to let someone else define your life. My sister told a room full of officers' wives that I was unstable. My father told a judge that I embarrassed the family. None of that mattered. Because the only person responsible for deciding what my life looked like was me. I stepped outside into the afternoon sun. For the first time in a long time, the world felt quiet. And quiet, it turns out, is a pretty good place to start the rest of your life. I finished my coffee, stepped outside, and started walking down the street. The city sounded normal again. Cars, footsteps, someone laughing 2 blocks away. If you had walked past me right then, you wouldn't have known that my sister had just been taken away in handcuffs, or that a $12 million fraud case had just exploded inside a federal courtroom. Life doesn't pause for anyone's personal drama, and honestly, that's probably a good thing. Because once the noise fades, you're left with the part that actually matters. The lesson. A lot of people ask what it feels like to win a situation like that. The truth is, it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like clarity. For years, my family told a story about me. The unstable daughter, the embarrassment, the one who couldn't hold her life together. And when you hear something long enough, even a smart person can start wondering if maybe there's some truth buried in it. That's how manipulation works. People repeat the same version of you until you start doubting the real one. So if you're watching this and there's one thing I want you to understand, it's this. Never let someone else write the definition of who you are. Because once you accept their version of your story, you start living inside their expectations. My sister needed me to be the broken one. Without that role, her version of success didn't make sense. Some people don't measure themselves by what they build. They measure themselves by what they stand next to. If the person next to them looks smaller, they feel bigger. That illusion lasted for Kelsey, right up until the moment federal agents walked into that courtroom. And here's the second thing I learned. People who talk the most about their success usually have the most to hide. Think about the last person you met who kept reminding everyone how impressive they were. How often do those stories actually hold up under scrutiny? Vance loved telling people about his $12 million contract, the watch, the business, the connections. He repeated those details so often that he started believing they were proof of legitimacy. But confidence isn't evidence, and flashy success doesn't survive contact with a forensic audit. The people who are actually doing meaningful work rarely spend their time announcing it to strangers. They're too busy doing the work. There's another lesson buried inside that courtroom scene too. Silence is a powerful tool. Everyone thinks the strongest response to an attack is a louder attack. But when you're dealing with someone who lies for a living, arguing usually helps them. It gives them more space to spin new stories. The moment I stopped reacting, Kelsey had nothing to push against, so she pushed against herself. She talked more. She escalated. She exposed the very instability she was trying to accuse me of. And eventually she shouted the words that made everyone in the room stop trusting her. People who can't tolerate silence will eventually sabotage themselves inside it. That's not just true in courtrooms. It's true in everyday life. If someone is determined to prove you wrong, the best strategy isn't always to fight them. Sometimes the smartest move is to let them keep talking until the truth shows up on its own. Another thing this situation reminded me is that money doesn't destroy families. Greed does. My grandfather's trust fund didn't suddenly make Kelsey a criminal. The money was just an opportunity. Greed was the decision. And greed always comes with a justification. People convince themselves they deserve something, that the rules shouldn't apply to them, that whatever they're doing is really just correcting an unfair situation. Once someone builds that story in their head, they can rationalize almost anything: fraud, lies, even trying to legally declare their own sister insane. Which brings me to the hardest lesson in this entire story: setting boundaries with family. Most people are taught that family loyalty should come before everything. And loyalty is important, but loyalty without limits becomes permission. If someone repeatedly hurts you, manipulates you, or tries to control your life, the title of family doesn't magically make that behavior acceptable. You're allowed to step away from people who refuse to treat you with respect. Even if you share their last name, even if you grew up in the same house, that doesn't make you disloyal. It means you understand that healthy relationships require mutual respect. The final lesson is probably the simplest one. Peace is more valuable than revenge. A lot of stories end with the hero celebrating the downfall of their enemy. But when those courtroom doors closed behind Kelsey and Vance, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when a long problem finally reaches its natural ending. I didn't destroy my sister. She destroyed herself. All I did was refuse to participate in the lie. And that's something anyone can do. You don't need a badge, a courtroom, or a federal investigation to apply that lesson. You just need the courage to stay honest about who you are and the patience to let reality reveal itself. Because here's the truth most people eventually discover. The truth may move slowly, it may take months, sometimes years, but lies have a built-in expiration date. Eventually, they run out of room. And when that happens, the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to show up.
Final note. This story is a work of fiction, but the valuable lessons we discuss are entirely real and continue to happen to many people every day. If this style isn't for you, that's perfectly okay. Please feel free to look for other content that better suits your needs.